You're listening to the Bear in Mind podcast, episode number 88.
A podcast uncovering identity, color, and love, where driving yourself crazy is totally sane and curable. Now your host, T. Bias.
Did you know that ignoring somebody is an emotional reaction? It doesn't look like that. Sometimes it looks like you're not responding to a message, or you've decided, yes, I'm going to set boundaries, I'm going to set limits, and you decide to ignore somebody's message. And oftentimes, it most likely is coming from an emotion like anger. You're reacting to that emotion. And so before I get into this, I want to clarify what ignoring someone is. Now, there are times that maybe that you are going to set limits with your time. And when you do that with the people in your life, it's not like you're going to be ignoring them. You are going to set limits with the amount of time you have and things like that. And there very well may be people in your life that you decide you're not going to continue a relationship. And I'm not really talking about those times. I'm talking about when you purposely decide not to respond to a message, and you purposely decide even not to respond to something someone says to your face. Oftentimes, it's good to check in with yourself if that's coming from an emotional reaction, and it's usually going to be anger. And I hadn't really thought of ignoring somebody as coming from an emotional reaction like anger until I read it in a book by Suzette Haden Elgin, You Can't Say That to Me. And she goes over what she calls what chronic people do, who are people who verbally abuse. And I think one of the things that was eye-opening is that a lot of times we are told in life is to ignore people that say things to us. Ignore them if they make a joke about you, ignore them if they say something mean. That will actually stop people from continuing to treat you in a way that you don't want them to treat you. And I can tell you from experience that has never worked. And I didn't discover this as an adult, although all throughout my childhood, I think that was very common advice from the adults in my life. Just ignore them, because you feed into it. And when I read Elgin's work, and she has written so many books on language and the psychology of language. And when I looked inside myself, I could really see that ignoring somebody doesn't work, because I'm still responding to someone out of a place of irritation, out of a place of anger. So it never really resolves the problem that's happening inside of you. You're irritated and you're angry about them, and then you have this reaction and you ignore the person. And I'm really only talking about when you are purposely doing it and it is coming from this place of anger. And you know that is coming from a place of anger when you are thinking that if I ignore them, then the other person will change. And that is really how you know that when you're purposely ignoring someone, that is coming from anger, that approach is in an effort to change how they treat you. And it never works, because we know, and I've said this many times, we can't ever change somebody. But I think it's so fascinating the number of ways in which we react to situations, and it's very subtle, but we're still trying to change the other person. And I think when we ignore people, because it doesn't look like anger, right? It doesn't look like irritation. It looks almost calm, and it's deceiving, and we're yet still trying to get the other person to behave a certain way. So I have found in my life that ignoring somebody is actually a very ineffective way of, one, dealing with my anger, of two, of actually solving the real problem, which is me feeling angry, and I don't want to feel angry. And a good way to really check yourself on how much of your go-to reaction is ignoring somebody is in your current relationships. How are you responding to things that slightly irritate you. And it could even be, you can go to the extreme if somebody name calls you, but a lot of times we have irritation, and sometimes the things people even text us, like if we say, hey, do you want to go do something? And someone gives you an answer that isn't a definite yes or no, kind of like this middle of the road answer. I know that sometimes that kind of used to irritate me. That how many times that you decide, well, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm not even going to text her back. And it's coming from this little place of, I'm kind of irritated. I don't want to deal with this. And why that is actually still an emotional reaction, and why that emotional reaction, even though it seems like it's going to solve something, won't actually solve anything in your relationship. When you go to ignore somebody, it'll never get you the relationship you want, because you're still coming from a place of anger towards the other person. And sometimes we can sense when somebody is angry with us, but it is also how you're showing up in those relationships. So if you're showing up from ignoring somebody because you're irritated with how they behave, you're going to continue to have those types of relationships where you're wanting the other person to change, and you use kind of all these tactics, and you're coming from this place of anger that may not look like shouting or anything like that. And it's because you're deciding that the quality of your relationship is going to be about how the other person treats you rather than how you're going to show up and treat the other person. And so once I started noticing that this was kind of my pattern in relationships, then I noticed that I was the one that needed to change it. So my tactic was often just to ignore messages, and I was irritated with how somebody said things to me, and I would just be like, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm not even going to respond. That's how it's going to be. Delete or something like that. And where I started is I started very small, and I decided I am going to respond to people's messages. And I'm going to start from this place of, okay, at least start from this one word. So even if someone says something to me and I'm not excited about it, I'm irritated with it, I can start with the word okay. It's a very simple word. And it even works in situations where the advice when you're a kid and people are making fun of you, or the advice that often adults give their children is, oh, just ignore somebody who's kind of pestering you or something like that. But even there, you can just be like, okay. You can even just say the word okay to somebody. And if you notice, it often takes a little bit of the edge off of that conversation to come at a place of okay instead of coming at a place of I'm irritated, I'm ignored. Now, you may still feel irritated, and I'm not saying take that emotion away, but one of the things is it can move you a little bit towards accepting of that person. And it may seem even weird to even think that, well, I'm accepting a person who maybe constantly puts you down or has these backhanded compliments or something like that. And even in those situations, let's say it's a colleague or something, and they do that, even the word okay works in those situations. It does take the edge off, and it doesn't come as a counterattack to what they're saying. Ignoring does. It's like, oh, I'm going to ignore whatever it is that you say to me. And it still communicates anger back to the person. And then the nature, the pattern of a relationship that you're not satisfied in won't ever change. And it only really takes one person to ever change and break a pattern in a relationship. And with ignoring, you may not feel like you know what to say to the things that someone says to you that you're irritated in or you don't like in a relationship. You can always start with the word okay and start from there. And one of the things I noticed where I was purposely ignoring people because of the way they were acting is I started to notice that I was ignoring people because they weren't following a certain script. They weren't behaving a certain way. And I was doing this. And once I could say okay and practice it a little bit more, I then found different words to say to them that didn't actually come from anger. I allowed myself to be angry and then allow myself to say, I can choose something else, and that action doesn't have to come from anger. I can only start with the word okay. And that's all I have for you this week. I'll check back with you next.
Thanks for listening. Listen for a new episode next Tuesday by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. Bye for now.